Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining me for this first webinar in a series of webinars brought to you by Mondadori Education in Italy. My name is Steve Taylor Knowles, and some of you you might know me already because I've been to Italy quite a few times. I'm a teacher trainer, and I'm a writer. Perhaps some of you have used my courses. I wrote a course called Laser for teenagers that was very popular. I wrote a series of grammar and vocabulary books called Destination. And recently, I've been working on a new series called Optimize. And I know that my co-author, Malcolm Mann, is coming out to Italy this year to speak to some of you, to show you some of the features of the course. And what I want to talk about today is very much rooted in the work that we did in preparation for this course. And I want to give you some insight into what was going through our minds when we were putting together Optimize. I want to talk about preparing students for exams. Most of my career has been spent preparing teenagers, in particular, preparing younger and older teenagers for international exams, such as the Cambridge main suite of exams, Cambridge First for Schools, Advanced, Proficiency. And I want to talk about two key aspects of preparing students for exams that I want my students in the classroom when they're preparing and in the exam room when they're sitting the exam, that I want them to bear in mind throughout the whole process. Because I think that is what gives them the edge. You know, when I'm writing or when I'm talking to teachers, people want tips. What tips do you have for students taking exams? And my single biggest tip is teach them English. There is no real reason why exam preparation should be any different from general English teaching. I don't believe that there's any reason for that. You know, often you look at exam preparation books and they can be quite dry and unengaging. And I've never really understood why there's any reason for that. Let's have a look at some PowerPoint. Optimize is a course that is a fully featured, modern, contemporary 21st century course. So as you would expect, it's got all the components to support the student's book that you would expect from any kind of course. A fully featured teacher's book, the presentation kit, a digital offering. And I hope in the future to be able to come out to Italy and talk to you about some of the features that I think make Optimize a really interesting course. Now, having said that, what we really need to focus on is teaching English and engaging our students. The main route into that is engaging them in terms of the content that we present them with. So, for example, in Optimize, we've got lots of really interesting readings and topics. The content is very interesting. This, for example, is these are all taken from the B1 plus level, I think. This is a text about a Canadian family who decided that they would try to live life as if it was 1986. Now, if you're anything like a lot of the audiences of teachers that I stand in front of, a lot of you probably weren't even born in 1986. I was born in 1986. I was 20 in 1986. And of course, it was a time before not a time before mass communication, but it was a time before the internet, a time before email. I have an 8-year-old daughter called Scout, and recently she said to me, "You know, Daddy, I think when you were young, the only things that were invented were trees and houses." And she has a point. Now, of course, in 1986, we had a bit more than just trees and houses, but not much more. So this is a really interesting content. This is really interesting content for teenagers today, trying to imagine a time before all the technology that surrounds us. Now, this is a very interesting area. Nobody under the age of about 25 watches TV much these days. They're all online watching YouTube stars, following YouTube stars. So we've tried to introduce some of that content into the classroom. Ethical fashion. This is about how jeans are made. It's presented in the format of a class project, and it's all about how jeans are made and the kind of ethical considerations around the various steps. You know, the blue dye in jeans, for example, causes a lot of pollution, that kind of thing. And now this is an area that really interests me. I think in the classroom, I always aim to not to preach to students, because I think from the student's point of view, constantly being presented with fast food is bad for you, do not eat fast food, get more exercise, look after the environment, don't play video games. Now, of course, all these, there's a valid point behind all of these. But at the same time, I like to sometimes take a more sideways look at these topics and think, well, are there things that that students get out of some of these things, like video games? And when you play video games, there are in fact a lot of life skills that you acquire from video games, such as map reading, these days with online video games, cooperating with other players, planning, strategizing. I should just say at this point, by the way, that if you have any questions, then I'll be dealing with questions at the end of the webinar. I'll leave enough time to talk about questions. So when we're putting together courses, we make a real effort to engage students. We put all kinds of interesting content in front of them. We try to personalize it. We try to make it relevant to their lives, their interests. And then when it comes to exam time, we put something like that in front of them. What I want to think about today is how do we bridge that gap between teaching them English and getting them to jump through all the kind of hoops that examiners ask them to jump through. In other words, what are some ways of helping our students prepare for this kind of exam task that on the surface can seem a little bit divorced from our desire to actually get our students using English and activating their English? Throughout their experience in the classroom and in the exam, I want my students to bear in mind these two questions. What are they trying to test? And how can I give myself the best chance? This is like looking at it from two different points of view. Looking at it from the examiner's point of view and looking at it from the candidate's point of view. I want my students to think like an examiner. Exam tasks are not put together at random. They're carefully designed to test particular things. So what we've done in Optimize, this is particularly at the B1 plus level where we're making a transition into the final B2 year of taking First for Schools. I want students to bear in mind these two things: exam skills and exam strategies. Exam skills are things like scanning, skimming, giving reasons, the things that exam tasks try to test. So a given exam task will test your ability to express preferences. For example, in the First for Schools, in the interview, when you have to compare photographs and you may have to express preferences at that point, they are deliberately trying to test your ability to express preferences or your ability to give reasons. Or in the reading and use of English paper, they might be testing your ability to scan or your ability to skim. At the same time, I want my students to think about exam strategies. Now, exam strategies are the techniques that you should be employing for a particular exam task. So when you're doing multiple choice questions, for example, there's a particular technique to doing that kind of task, and that is relevant to any time when you do multiple choice questions. I mean, really, I'm talking about, I'm setting what I'm saying in the context of high stakes exams like the Cambridge First for Schools. But what I'm saying applies equally to all test situations. So the kind of unit tests that come with a course like Optimize, the kind of tests that you write for your students, the kind of exams within a school setting, within an institution, international exams, 9 times out of 10, those kind of exams use common exam types like multiple choice questions, sentence transformations, true-false tests. And the techniques from one to another exam situation have a lot in common, or maybe even are exactly the same. So here, I've taken this from the Cambridge Handbook. So this is the Cambridge Handbook example of this kind of multiple choice close task. Some of you may prepare your students for this kind of exam where students are given a text, certain words are missing, and they are given 4 options for which word goes in the gap. So our first question should be, what kind of thing are they trying to get at with this task? Now, luckily for us, for our purposes, Cambridge is very good at specifying what their exams are trying to test. Not all exam bodies are as clear or as explicit as Cambridge. And in the First for Schools handbook, Cambridge says that the main focus, as you would expect, is on vocabulary, idioms, collocations, fixed phrases, complementation. Now, by complementation, they mean what we might also call colligation, or what we might call lexicogrammar. We're familiar with the idea that the English language has grammar, and that the English language is made up of words, of vocabulary, of idioms and collocations, etc. But also different words have grammar associated with them. For example, accuse somebody of doing. Now, the fact that we say accuse of plus ing is not exactly a characteristic of the English language. It's a characteristic of the verb accuse. So that's lexicogrammar, really, the grammar of lexical items. And when they say complementation here, that's what they mean. Phrasal verbs, semantic precision. In other words, choosing the word that has exactly the precise meaning that's relevant for the context. Okay, so that's what they state they are generally trying to test. Now, I want my students to look at each gap and figure out what's being tested at each point in a text like this. So this is about having a range of idioms, collocations, complementation, etc. at your fingertips. But it's also about how you manipulate those kind of things. Clearly here, they're trying to test the collocation give a performance, as opposed to in some other languages it will be make a performance or do a performance. But in English we give a performance, and that's what they're trying to test. So the answer clearly is A. But look at these examples as well. Gave a performance. Gave his one and only performance. Gave what would for many people become his most memorable performance. The memorable performance which he gave on his debut. Now, these are all increasing maybe in complexity. These are all ways of testing exactly the same collocation. So the first point I want to make about preparing for this kind of activity is that we need our students to be adept to practice manipulating the language that they learn. Too often, in one unit of a course book, they learn give a performance. And then the next unit, the grammar is the passive voice. But they never get to use the vocabulary they've learned earlier with the grammar that they're learning now. And they never really fully manipulate things as much as they should. So we need to be constantly recycling and giving our students the opportunity to take what they're learning and use it in different contexts with different grammar, so they never just learn give a performance, they manipulate it in various ways. So that's one big area that I think we do well to focus on. So if we look through a task like this, then we can see how it works when I want my students to focus on what is being tested. And the thing that is being tested usually either starts or ends in the gap. So the key things are usually the one, possibly two words either side of the gap. So students should be able to focus on the fact that in this example, he was actually helping blank his little sister. I want them to get at the fact that they're trying to test phrasal verbs. Now, what phrasal verb could it possibly be? Once you look at the options, help out his little sister is the only option that makes any sense. In the third gap, Hans enjoyed it so much that he blank himself in ballet classes. This is clearly a lexicogrammatical item of blank yourself in classes. These are the key words. And they're trying to test the fact that you enroll yourself in a class. With number 4, Hans has already blank attention. Well, what collocates with attention? Pay attention. That doesn't really make sense in this context. You can gain attention, or in this case, attract attention. And number 5, increase his blank of dance steps, range. And number 6, now number 6 is very interesting, because when your students focus on this, what mistake will your weaker students make? This person, Hans, says, I want to become stronger. Blank experience and learn as much as I can, he said. So what collocates with experience? Well, you can get experience or you can gain experience. What mistake will your weaker students make? They will think that gap 6 is trying to test something that starts before the gap. They will write than. They will think that it's trying to test, I want to become stronger than. Now, the thing that tells that it's not partly is the comma, of course, but also the context of the rest of the sentence. Let me just quickly finish the rest of it. So he's danced professionally in a variety of lead. Well, there's only really one. You could maybe have lead parts, but the word given was roles, so lead roles. And Hans has blank himself the goal of one day dancing. The key words here are blank yourself a goal. And the only thing that really collocates with that is to set yourself a goal. So partly the skill of doing this is for students to focus in on what is being tested at each point in the text. Now, in terms of exam strategies, in other words, the optimal techniques that you should employ to do this kind of task, I don't believe there's any one answer. It's about students thinking through the process and finding something that works for them. But I would suggest that a reasonable exam strategy is to first of all read the whole text for gist, then to try to identify the target structure at each gap. What are they testing? And then if you don't know the answer already, to try the options in turn, because often seeing which one sounds more natural, putting it into the sentence may prompt a memory of which phrase is actually correct. And then once you've made your choices, to quickly read the whole thing for sense, so that if you get to gap number 6, say, and you've put than, then when you read through, I want to become stronger than experience, then you realize that that doesn't really make sense and you need to think about it again. How do we translate that into tasks on a page and a flow of tasks in the classroom? Here's a page from Optimize that tries to work with exactly this kind of thing. The outcome of the lesson is task 4. So my aim is that when my students have finished this task, when my students have finished this lesson rather, I want them to do task 4 better than if we hadn't spent that time together and talked about what we've talked about. Now, as we said from the handbook, this kind of task is designed to test word patterns, collocations, idioms, confusable words. That's really semantic precision, phrasal verbs. And in this particular case, I want to focus on collocations. Throughout this whole course, I will focus on each of these in turn, but in this particular case, I want to focus on collocations. So how am I going to do that? Well, first of all, I want to orient my students towards the content. I don't want this to just come out of nowhere. I want to activate their thoughts about it. I want to start activating some ways of talking about it, some vocabulary. Now, this is all about green roofs, all about having gardens on the top of your building. Now, here in the UK, it doesn't work so well because we have sloping roofs. Partly because we get a lot of rain and we get snow. So in countries where you have rain and snow, often you have sloping roofs. In Mediterranean countries where you have where you don't get so much rain and snow, you often have flat roofs. And my writing partner Malcolm lives in Greece, and I know he wrote this because he has a garden on top of his building, on his own flat. He has a roof garden of his own. So I want to activate my students' knowledge of the content, get them thinking about it. And then I want to focus on the exam skill. What is it? What do we mean by collocations? How are they tested? What kind of things are there? So I want to talk to my students about and prompt them to come up with examples. So I want to think about types of collocations. For example, noun plus noun, or verb plus noun, or adjective plus noun. And so I will elicit examples from my students and then review some things that we've learned recently. Now, these all come from the course up to that point. So these are all things that students have seen before, and they're all collocations of various kinds, some of which make their way into the text in task 4. So perhaps I would get my students in pairs or in groups to remember whether we say make sure or have sure. Of course, we say make sure. Earth famous or world famous. World famous, of course. And to work through that and to remind themselves of a number of different collocations. Then I want them to start thinking about exam strategies. These are the specific techniques. So the technique may be decide if the collocation starts before the gap or in the gap, and say all the possible answers to yourself. For example, drawing their attention to number 7. Is it fresh studies? Is it recent studies? Is it latest studies? Is it unused studies? Try them in turn and see which one fits best. Cross out the ones that are definitely wrong, maybe leaving yourself with just 2. I don't know if you have, you probably did have, in the 90s, at least in the UK, and the 2000s, one of the most popular quiz shows was, I'm sure you had it in Italy as well. And one of the options, one of the lifelines you could take there was 50-50, which means you get rid of the 2 wrong answers, leaving 2 answers. Students can often do that themselves, leaving themselves to choose between 2 that may be possible answers. These are the ones that, in this case, I want them to really focus on. These are ones that are built on collocation. Again, taking them through exam technique, I want them to skim, discuss what you think the main points of the text are. I want them to get the general gist from skimming it. So when I put it together on the page, or when we put it together in the classroom as a sequence of tasks, this is the kind of flow of the lesson. It's going from a topic focus through an exam skill development, then exam strategy development, and finally, not quite finally, but one of the outcomes is that they do the exam task and they do it better than they would have done without the work that we've done together. Then I want to link it to their own lives. I want some personalization, and I want to encourage independent learning. There is no reason why in exam preparation we can't focus on personalization and independent learning. In Optimize, we've done it through this kind of think, research, culture, learn, and me box. So at the end of each section, each spread or each page, there's a box like this that is designed to personalize the learning or to encourage independent learning. So I just want to look at that in a little more detail, because this is very closely connected to the whole idea of life skills, critical thinking skills, 21st century skills. When this box is used for a think skill, this is very much about critical thinking, creative thinking, imaginative thinking. So this is from a unit about music. Imagine you could interview any musician or band. Who would you choose and what would you ask? So there I'm activating their hypothetical thinking skills. Research skills are a very important part of independent learning. Now, of course, a lot of research skills involve going online and finding things, Googling stuff. This is something slightly different, where I want them to ask their parents and grandparents about how leisure activities have changed over time and use people as a resource. Culture is about bringing it back to the student's home culture. Now, this is from a really interesting section that I wrote, which was about the history of the weekend. You know, the weekend had to be invented, and the modern weekend really was invented. There were 2 big factors that contributed towards the modern weekend. One was the Industrial Revolution in the northwest of England. Right now, I'm speaking to you from a town called Bolton, which is outside Manchester in the northwest of England. And this whole area was built on the cotton industry during the Industrial Revolution. And it was one of the first places in the world where people started to work in factories en masse. And when you've got a factories either completely closed down or they are completely running. So it was because of the factory timetable that they devised the weekend really came into its own. Of course, people have always rested on Sunday, but the whole idea of having 2 days off at the weekend, that was a product of the industrial. And also, I realize I'm straying from the point a little bit, but it is interesting. Henry Ford in America, in the early part of the 20th century, he had people making the first mass-produced cars, the Model T Ford. And in order to give his workers the chance to buy and enjoy driving the cars they were making, he gave them the weekend off. So the weekend has a really interesting history. So this comes from a section in a unit where they've been thinking about the weekend, and I want them to relate it back to their own culture, their own country, about what's the typical working week in Italy, what do people do at the weekend in Italy, so that it feels connected to them and not as abstract as it otherwise could be. In the learn section, this is particularly where we emphasize and encourage independent learning. It usually comes off the back of something they've been doing in class. In this case, they've been looking at the lexicographer of some phrases, and I want them to go off and find agree with somebody, agree to do, dislike doing, imagine doing, and refuse to do, and then write example sentences. And then the me section, that's all about their personal lives, their routines, their families, their own interests. So this is from a section about family events, and this is about you, your family. When will you get together with your extended family? What's your next big family event? So those 5 categories really give us the ability to cover in quite a compact format. It gives us the ability to cover a very broad range of possible personalization and independent learning areas. Here's another reading and use of English section. This is the gapped text. Some of you will be familiar with it. Students are given a text and sentences have been removed and another sentence has been added, and students have to decide which sentence goes back in which gap. Okay, how can we help our students with this? Well, what does it test? According to the First for Schools handbook, it tests coherence, cohesion, and text structure. Let's just remind ourselves what coherence and cohesion are, and then look at how we can work on those in the classroom. Coherence. A says, could you give me a lift home? And B says, sorry, I'm visiting my sister. This is coherent if A knows that B's sister lives on the other side of town. Coherence is about the content. It's about whether it makes sense in terms of ideas. If B's sister lived next door to A, and A says, could you give me a lift home? And B says, sorry, I'm visiting my sister. Then A would say, huh? That doesn't make sense. She lives next door to me. So coherence is about the relationship between ideas. Cohesion is about the relationship between language, between bits of language, the way in which texts are held together by language. So, for example, if A says, is Jenny coming to the party? B says, yes. That's the answer to a yes-no question. She, that's Jenny, converted into a pronoun for somebody already referred to, and is, that's the auxiliary from the present continuous is coming. So this is cohesive because it's held together by the relationship between the linguistic relationships between the different parts. Coherence is about the way in which text makes sense in terms of content, ideas, etc. And cohesion, the way in which text makes sense in terms of connecting phrases, pronouns, etc. What is the main problem that our students have when they're reading a text? I think one big problem is that our students' reading can be one-dimensional. In other words, they only know one way of reading, which is they start at word number 1 and they read every word until they finish at word number 600. And that's the only way they have of interacting with text. Our job as teachers, I think, is partly to make their reading multidimensional, to find different ways of having them engage with texts in different ways. This, for example, this is from Optimize. As you can see at the top right, they're going to read a text about a violinist. This whole unit is about music, and it's a gapped text. Task number 5 is an exam style gapped text. So how do I want to start? How do I want to complicate their reading of this text? Well, I want them to think about text logic. So that's the exam skill I want to focus on. In other words, I don't really want to use the terms coherence and cohesion with my students. I think it's bad enough for us teachers to try and remember and distinguish between them. I don't want to confuse my students necessarily with those terms, but when I say understanding text logic, that's about coherence, of course. So task 3 is about matching paragraphs to summaries of the topic at that point in the text. So this is getting students from a more from an overview position to look at the way in which texts are in this particular case, the way in which this particular text is put together. And I also want them to look at the sentences that have been removed to see what the topic of the sentences are, the topic of each sentence is, because I want them to draw links between the topic in the sentence and the topic at that point in the text. That's a key skill when it comes to putting them back together. How else can I work with this idea of coherence? Well, here's a task from Optimize. This is about screen time, the amount of time students spend looking at their phone, looking at their iPads, whatever they're doing on their screens, video games. And this is practicing ing or infinitive. They need to take the verbs from the box and put them into the text in the right form. Now, this in itself isn't necessarily working on coherence. This is a contextualized way of practicing these word patterns. But off the back of that, there are some interesting things that you can do if you find articles of your own. This is an article I found. As I said, I'm always interested in things that go against conventional wisdom. This is from gizmodo.com. This is the idea that perhaps we're wrong about limiting children's screen time. How can I use, if I find an article like that, how can I use it to develop my students' understanding of coherence? Break it into paragraphs. Let them read the first paragraph, and then I want to know, where do they think it's going? Because, you know, texts often are like inverted pyramids. There are an infinite number of options for the first paragraph of a text. There are far fewer options for the second paragraph of a text. And then often there are fewer options for the third paragraph of a text, because the logic of texts tends to pull it in one of a few directions. So I want my students to predict, where is it going? Is it going to talk about A, or is it going to talk about B? In this case, it talks about B. And then the next paragraph, is it going to talk about A, or is it going to talk about B? So I want them to reconstruct the text. This is a very powerful way of practicing coherence and making our students' reading more multidimensional. What about cohesion? Now, the first aspect that I want to mention about in connection with cohesion is something that teachers are very familiar with: linking words and phrases. Here I've got my text is a piece of fiction, and again it's a gapped text, and students are going to put back, well, they're going to look at phrases, connecting phrases, and then they're going to look at the sentences and the text to find these connecting phrases. We're all familiar with it. I would say that this is probably the thing that we most focus on when we're thinking about the gapped text. We think about linking phrases. And that's fine. That is an important part of cohesion, no doubt. However, I think there are other things that we often forget. This is from a unit about lifelong learning, and students are reading a text about things learned outside school, for example, riding a skateboard or juggling. Now, in this case, I don't want to focus on linking phrases. I want to focus on pronouns. Pronouns are an important part of what holds texts together. They are key cohesive devices. But I do think that often we focus on useful phrases and linking phrases and forget about some of the other cohesive devices that are usually used in text. In fact, that are used more often in text. So I want students to think about the pronouns, and then I want them to look at the text, and I want them to look at the sentences that have been removed, look at the pronouns. What do they refer to? So that's what that's good preparation for this kind of test. We need to prepare, we need to practice develop their understanding of coherence, practice tasks that focus on different elements of cohesion, and part of both of those is getting them to understand text structure in a more sophisticated way. What are good exam strategies? Well, again, students might settle on their own strategies if they are effective, but I think probably it's about reading for gist. It's about identifying the topic at each gap. It's about underlining key cohesive devices. So if we look at the sentences in more detail, the first word is a cohesive device, so. The second word, they, is a cohesive device. In B, this and them. In C, this and him and he. In G, in this way. So I want my students to focus on specific bits of language that are through which cohesion is achieved. Then I want them to match the topic and the cohesive devices to the gap. Then I want to match coherence and cohesion. And then, okay, they may not always have the luxury of this kind of time, but I want them to read quickly for sense to make sure that the whole thing hangs together correctly. Okay. So just to summarize, I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to look at a couple of questions, and we'll just spend another 10 or 15 minutes together just thinking about one or two questions. My main point is that students throughout their preparation and in the classroom should bear in mind two big questions. What is the examiner trying to test? What do they want? And secondly, how can I give it to them? What's the best way of giving it to them? As you can see from that slide, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. Please come along and be my friend. Do you know what? I'm the only Steve Taylor Knowles on the internet. I've got a very distinctive name. I'm the only Steve Taylor Knowles, so you can always find me. If you've used my materials, or if you start using Optimize or any other of my materials, and you want to ask me anything, then I'm always available. Facebook Messenger is probably the best way of getting in touch. Okay. Okay, I think. All right, thank you so much. Now, I'm just looking at a few questions. Right. I've got a question here. My students struggle with sentence transformations. What advice do you have for preparing for that kind of task? Good question. Sentence transformations are interesting, aren't they? Because if you were trying to design an exam task that had the least connection to real world use of English, then you may well come up with sentence transformations. They're the exam task that's most like solving crossword puzzles, which is fine for some of us. You know, I think if I was learning English, I think it would appeal to me. I like puzzles, I like crosswords, so I think it would appeal to me, but it doesn't appeal to everyone. What can we do to help our students with those tasks? Well, I think one good technique is just give them the first sentence. Don't give them the key word. Don't give them the second sentence. Just give them the first sentence and ask them, maybe in groups or pairs, to predict what they think this is trying to test. Because sentence transformations can't just test anything. They don't just test language. They test specific things like passive voice, phrasal verbs, lexicogrammatical complementation. And if your first sentence is, let's say, he managed to open the window, you know for sure that the sentence, the thing being tested, is to go from manage to succeed in doing. 9 times out of 10, that's what's going on. So I think by giving students just the first sentence and asking them to put themselves in the position of the examiner and ask, what is this testing? What's the possible answer? And then give them the key word and see if they've got any closer, and then give them the second sentence, by which time they've probably all figured it out. 9 times out of 10, you don't need the key word or the gapped sentence to do a sentence transformation. So I think that's my tip for sentence transformations. Somebody has asked here, what exercises can we do to strengthen memory? We're talking, aren't we, about a particular kind of memory. We're talking about the kind of memory that is used when you learn a musical instrument. You know, speaking English, using and speaking English is not like learning a bunch of history facts. It's not about learning facts about language. I know that often it feels like that because we often present grammatical rules like that. What is the second conditional? If plus would plus etc. But in fact, the skill of using English is more analogous to the skill of playing a musical instrument. It's not about taking a body of knowledge from here and putting it in students' heads. It's about training students in the same way that we train people to play the violin or play the guitar. So I think it's about the techniques are the same. I think it demands practice. I think it demands practice of the same kind of thing in different contexts. Like I was saying earlier at the start, we need to find connections between, we need to be constantly recycling vocabulary in new grammar. We're now doing the passive voice. Let's recycle some of the vocabulary we learned when we were doing the past continuous. Don't allow things to become too separated and too linear. Keep churning it up and keep manipulating and bringing things back. So I think that's what I would say about strengthening that particular kind of memory. Let me take one more question. Some of my students don't like speaking in class. How can I get them talking? There's no doubt that there is a kind of affective barrier in a lot of classrooms. When you open your mouth to speak in front of maybe 30 other people, there's a lot of possibility for embarrassment, for failure, for getting it wrong. Now, I think that my approach to that is twofold, really. I think there are two things that I would say about that. The first is that I think it's largely, a lot of it is to do with the classroom atmosphere we create and our attitude towards what our students say. So if we ask our students content questions like, what's your favorite type of music? Then if our student responds to the content, but with errors, then I think we have to be careful of always jumping in and correcting those errors, because we create an atmosphere where our classroom interaction becomes a matter of error correction. And I think that that whole area of error correction should be part of what happens in our classroom, but there's a danger that we allow it to become too great. And so students feel inhibited because they want to say, maybe they want to engage with the content and they want to say, I love hip hop, but they say, I love the hip hop, and we jump in and say, we don't say the hip hop, do we? So I think partly it's about us backing away sometimes from our desire to overcorrect. That's part of it. I think another part of it is the way in which we stage classroom activities in terms of pair work and group work. Now, I think that the whole group dynamics I find very interesting. I'm very interested in cooperative learning and how we set up groups so that cooperative learning really happens rather than just discussing groups. I think that we need to use pair work and group work and to think about it carefully in order to give people the space to use English in a less threatening situation. I mean, there's a lot of classroom management, a lot of interesting things going on with group work, and I hope to come over and be able to talk to you some of you about some of the interesting angles of that. But I think that when it comes to speaking, my advice is those two angles. First of all, think about the role of error correction in your classroom. And secondly, think about how I can get my students talking to each other rather than talking to me, which is a far less high stakes error correction situation. Okay, thank you all so very much. And thanks to Macmillan Education for arranging this webinar, and to Mondadori Education for all their logistical help. I hope you've got something out of it. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you. I believe that this is the first in a whole series of webinars arranged over the coming months. And I know some of the people who are giving the webinars, and I know that you've got some fantastic speakers lined up and some really interesting angles on education. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you in Italy soon. Thank you very much.